Well, good morning, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the lovely weather we have here today. And I think maybe that's a very nice harbinger of the kind of seminar we have today. My name is Ken Bever. I'm a research associate at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk here at Cambridge University. Very pleased to welcome you today to a seminar which is jointly organized by the Cambridge Center for Environment, Energy, and Natural Resource Governance, or Synergy. It's kind of how you pronounce the abbreviation. And with huge thanks to our colleague, Dr. Sergei Kolesnikov, who's been very generous to co-host this event with us. It's not the first one, so that shows the partnership between us and also Synergy and the Department of Land Economy. But also to appreciate some of my colleagues, especially Laura as well, who's helped us to put it all together, she's done the magic behind to make sure we're all here, but also everything is set up nicely. So without much ado, today we'll be talking a bit about a very interesting topic, and that's climate change. And it comes from the back of COP29, for those who follow climate change negotiations that happened in Baku. And for those who are following the negotiations very closely, it was kind of very dramatic because, of course, this month has been dramatic in many ways when you think about international politics, but because the negotiations almost collapsed because of various reasons. But I think that underscores the difficulty of addressing the climate change crisis. So against that backdrop here today, we are very lucky to have a colleague, Dr. Luca Mavelli, who will be sharing with us part of this research project on thinking of how we could collectively address this problem, but also some of the very interesting strategies that some of the generators of the risk that drives climate change adopt in the kind of trying to frame a solution. Just a quick backdrop before I give a brief bio of Luca is we met actually the first time this year in June, I think at an international conference. It was happenstance, where you kind of just get to have a chit chat. We were on the coffee line, waiting for coffee. And we just picked a kind of a spark of conversation. And I found his project to be really fascinating. And I tried to convince him by the time we were done with 3 cups of coffee that he should give a seminar. And so I'm very happy that he managed to convince him and he's here today to share as well. So without much ado, Luca is a reader in politics and international relations at the University of Kent here in the UK, and a Leverhulme Research Fellow from 2023 to 2025, where he was working on the project We Are All in This Together, Climate Change and the Politics of Collective Responsibility. Of course, it's published extensively, and I'll just kind of pick a few of your publications. One is a book published in 2022 by Oxford University Press on neoliberal citizenship, sacred markets, sacred lives, but also another book on Europe's encounter with Islam, the secular and the post-secular. And it's published extensively in leading journals in international relations, in security, dialogue, international politics, and quite a number of other disciplines. So it brings a very interdisciplinary approach. So in terms of the seminar here today, so Luca will give us the seminar presentation for half an hour, 35 minutes. And then we'll open the floor for Q&A. So if you're online or here and you have any questions, please get them ready. And we'll take the questions after the presentation. And we'll finish at the top of the hour. So without much ado, welcome Luca, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much to Ken for the invitation and for the wonderful hospitality, to Laura and Nicole, with whom I've been in touch, and to the 2 centers hosting the event. So what I will be presenting today is part of a project on which I started to work a bit more than a year ago. Sorry, here. And it's a project that aims to explore the strategies of deception and deflection of responsibility of the oil industry. This is a project supported by the Leverhulme Trust. The project at the moment is structured in 4 dimensions. I am exploring how the oil industry is operating in relation to reality, in relation to space, time, and desire. And each of them represents a different paper. Now, you may have noticed that the title I'm giving today is slightly different from the one you have, because when I originally committed to come here, I thought I would present an overview of the project. But then while I was working on the presentation, I thought it would make more sense to focus on one specific dimension. So I will talk about reality, how the oil industry is changing our sense of reality. So this talk is based on the first paper. And I would like to start by showing you an ad. which introduces us to the question of reality, and is also particularly relevant because unlike other projects that I've started in the past, where I couldn't pinpoint a specific moment when I got interested, this ad is the catalyst that has triggered me into this research. At that specific moment, I knew that I had to explore the oil industries and its strategies of this section. So this is the ad, it lasts a minute. If I can ask for help, is it starting? Because I don't see it on the screen. I always have the first slide. So
Does the mouse go over that way? You might
ah,
have to-
sorry.
Sorry about that.
It's okay, thank you. Okay, so this is an ad by Esso, which is the brand name of ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil is the largest publicly traded oil company in the world. It's part of a campaign called Driving Less and Thoughtful Driving, where you can see it encourages you to ride a bike instead of taking the car. And I was really puzzled by this ad because somehow my first impression was, well, this is an ad about corporate social responsibility, like the one you can see about alcoholic beverages, drink responsibly. But here it's not just about, use fuel responsibly, but consume less fuel. So ExxonMobil claims to have diversified, but actually 98% of its profit comes from oil. So why are they kind of encouraging you to use less fuel, something which would be detrimental to their goal? So I had to make sense of this ad. So how can we make sense within the struggling with this? We can go. I can see it here now, but not there. I shouldn't have embedded the video. I knew this was, I've never done it before. I felt very proud and I knew I would be punished for that. And next time, just put the link. Okay, no to self. Here it is. All right, so how can we read that article, that ad within the existing literature on the strategies of communication of the oil industry? Well, the existing scholarship has argued that basically there have been two main phases, the phase of denialism and followed by a phase of new denialism. I argue that there is actually a third phase that is happening, which is whereby the oil industry is constructing a new reality for climate change. So I will briefly talk a little bit about denialism and new denialism, and then I will take it from there and explain why I think that the oil industry has moved beyond these two dimensions. So what is denialism? There's an extensive literature that has established that the oil industry knew about the impact of fossil fuel, of burning fossil fuel on climate change since the end of the 60s. There are scholars like Jeffrey Supran, for instance, who have extensively analyzed the discrepancy between the internal communications and the external communications of major oil companies. So oil companies have active research center inside. They already knew from the 60s that this had an impact. The reason for the research was not, of course, environmental concern, but was primarily about the question of sustainability. How sustainable is the business of oil if this is something that affects our environment? But what they did was not to communicate this information to the public. And so the strategy adopted is a strategy of denialism. Denialism is a broad term that in its most kind of basic form conveys the idea that what the oil industry did was for a long time simply denying the existence of climate change. Then he moved on to denying the fact that climate change had anthropogenic causes, so saying maybe there is such thing as climate change, but there's nothing to do with human activity, or maybe ascribing it to other greenhouse gases rather than fossil fuels. And as part of denialism, there was an active strategy of constructing doubts. This was done directly to direct communication, for instance, through the use of advertorials, which are a mixture of adverts in the form of an editorials. You can see these are, the one you see on your left, they were published in the 90s, the one on the right are more recent. Basically they kind of emphasize the climate change as the discourse surrounding climate change as lies that tell our children, because part of the rhetoric has also been that oil is about life, it's about future, it's about progress. And so, you know, if we were to follow those who argue that oil, burning fossil fuels affect climate change, produces climate change, we would be undermining the future of our children, playing on the notion of a film apocalypse now. There's no such thing as an apocalypse. And we don't know enough. Science is it's not something that there's no consensus on the idea of climate change. And therefore, there are doubts, and in doubt, you know, we shouldn't ban the use of fossil fuel or restrict it, because it's about progress. So this strategy very much resembles the one that has been adopted by the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry has long known that there's direct connection between smoking and lung cancer, and what they did was to deny that and finance research that found other connections, you know, like obesity and cancer, or high fat diet and cancer. What happens is that this strategy has progressively become untenable. So basically, by the end of the 90s, beginning of 2000, major oil companies begin to change their communication. Usually the moment where public awareness becomes widespread on climate change is the 1992 Rio conference. Now, the oil industry does not react homogeneously. Usually have European companies who take a more proactive approach, changing their strategy. And probably the best example in this case is BP, British Petroleum. BP in 2008 undergoes a major rebranding. So BP no longer stands for British Petroleum, but Beyond Petroleum, which I find it quite ironic, considering that 97% of profits of BP come from oil and gas, and it's called Beyond itself. Could be very interesting philosophical speculation that we could do, but I'll stop here. As part of this campaign, what they do, the campaign is centered on this notion of the carbon footprint. If you go online, you'll be able to see the ads. There's a person, an interviewer, that goes in the street that seemingly randomly stops people and asks, you know, do you know what is your carbon footprint? Do you know what impact you have on the environment? Do you know how you can reduce your carbon footprint? And this communication then is accompanied by the commitment that BP is doing in terms of reducing its own carbon footprint. So investing in low carbon fuel, trying to diversify its portfolio, investing in renewable energies. So this is a good example that shows the two dimensions of what can be described as new denialism. And the two dimensions are the individualization of responsibility and greenwashing. So what the oil industry has done, starting in 2000, BP first, and then followed by other companies, the last one to join this communication is ExxonMobil, who only publicly admitted the existence of climate change in 2014, is to basically either directly blame consumers, says, ultimately it's up to consumers who buy this product, or to do a kind of softer communication, like in the one that we had, where the problem of climate change is ultimately a matter of personal consumption choices. You have the choice between driving the car or riding a bike. If you ride the bike, you save the environment and your daughter is happy. And we are willing to take a price for that. So this is where the existing literature stands in terms of development. So from denialism, denying the existence of climate change, to a phase in which the oil industry acknowledges the existence of climate change and says, okay, we all need to work together and we are doing our part by claiming to invest in renewable energies or in low carbon fuels. Now, this is all part of a greenwashing strategy, making appear environmentally sustainable what is not, because all major oil companies, their core business is oil and gas. And as has been said, there's no such thing as low carbon oil, which gives the idea as kind of low fat yogurt. The only thing that can be low in oil is the amount of carbon that you use in the process of extraction. But when you burn it, the amount that comes out, that is. Now, I think that there is another dimension that we need to consider. And if we want to identify a moment, that is the COP of last year, COP28. And I think the oil industry now is undertaking a new strategy, constructing a new reality for climate change. So COP28 last year, chaired by Al Jaber. Al Jaber is an oil executive, is the CEO of ADNOC, which is United Arab Emirates National Oil Company. United Arab Emirates is a country whose revenue mostly rely on oil and is one of the top world's producer. Al Jaber himself can be regarded as a controversial figure because he has made some statement that could be regarded as expression of denialism. He said that there's no settled science, even though he backtracked on that. And the question that for me was really puzzling when COP last year took place was, how could the CEO of an oil company help to solve a problem that the company itself and the industry it belongs to contributed to create? So Al Jaber's appointment has been described as paradoxical and hypocritical, but I think there is more there, and it's not just about Al Jaber, but it's about other oil executives and the extent to which their rhetoric is changing. They're not just talking about individualization of responsibility and greenwashing, but they're actually talking about something else. And I think they're trying to change the reality of climate change and the reality of themselves. So Al Jaber has said, the oil and gas industry has a special responsibility for addressing climate change because, these are his words, with great power comes great responsibility. The CEO of BP, Bernard Looney, has also said that the oil industry has a special responsibility. Same ExxonMobil. World-scale problems like climate change need world-scale companies to help solve them, like ExxonMobil. So we have moved from a phase in which the oil industry was denying the existence of climate change to a phase in which the oil industry says, yes, there is climate change, but it's a kind of collective responsibility and we all have to do our part, to a new phase in which the oil industry is saying, we can solve the problem. So from climate villain to climate savior. But what they can actually solve, what is climate change? So my argument is that as part of this change in rhetoric comes also an ontological transformation of the very reality of climate change. So what is climate change? For Al Jaber, climate change is a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity. The world needs a business mindset to tackle the climate crisis. Looney, BP, exactly the same argument. Climate change is an enormous business opportunity, and the same for Darren Woods of ExxonMobil. So climate change is being reframed as a techno-capitalist challenge, that will deliver growth, will deliver wealth, will deliver opportunity. And just to stress, when they say for us, they're not just meaning for BP, for ExxonMobil, they're saying for the world. They're talking about the widespread social benefit that their leadership in tackling the climate crisis will bring. So this kind of challenged my previous understanding of climate change. I thought climate change was about the loss of biodiversity, the uneven use and access to resources, environmental justice, protecting the planet for future generation, and ultimately ensuring the continuation of life on Earth. Now, the reality of climate change now has been replaced by its complete economization. There is a new reality that is being constructed. And in fact, the CEO of ExxonMobil has said it. The past doesn't matter. We need to invest in the market-oriented solution for tomorrow. So if we follow the advice of BP, what is the best thing you can do to save the environment? The best thing people can do, Looney has said, is to invest in a carbon-intensive company like BP and back them going green. So I see there a complete reversal of reality. If you want to save the environment, what you're being told is that the best thing you can do is to invest in an oil company. So the argument I advance is that with this new shift that the oil industry is undertaking, the existential question of climate change has been liquidated and artificially resurrected in the system of science of the market. So this is the conceptual framework of my argument. The shift from denialism to new denialism, which is often treated in the literature as two different moments, in my view, it's actually represent part of the same logic. With denialism and new denialism, the oil industry was denying, or more correctly, masking reality. Because with denialism, the oil industry was masking the existence of climate change, and with new denialism, the oil industry is masking the reality of the oil industry and willingness to address the climate change. So it is masking something that all these discursive approaches, they operate with reference to a baseline reality. There is climate change. Either we deny that climate change exists, or we say, yes, climate change exists, but we propose solutions that mask the reality, like driving a bike or claiming that we are investing in green energy. So the oil industry used to work within a framework of misrepresentation. What I contend is that the oil industry now is trying to construct a new reality for climate change and the oil industry. So the framework has shifted. Now there is a loss of a baseline reality. We have entered into what Jean Baudrillard called the world of simulation. Now, the conceptual part of my paper draws heavily on the philosophy of Baudrillard, simulacra and simulation, but I will not go into that because it's quite dense and not easy to convey unless we have 5 hours here to spend. So I would like, though, to highlight a little bit the difference between misrepresentation and simulation, just providing a couple of illustrations. The problem of reality, the problem of misrepresentation is a classical philosophical problem. One of the oldest formulation in philosophical terms is Plato's allegory of the cave. You have, on your left, a representation of that. Plato tells the story of a group of men who are chained in a cave. The only thing that they can see are the shadows projected on a wall by other people who are kind of manufacturing those shadows using shapes. The chained men, Plato says, think that what they're seeing is reality, but actually that is a travesty of reality and misrepresentation. So what is the task of knowledge? What is the task of philosophy? What is the goal of the philosopher? Well, it's helping men to free themselves, human beings, Plato speaks, men, helping human beings to free themselves from the chains that tie humanity, from the misrepresentation and exit. We have a similar problematization with Descartes. Descartes is concerned, how can we get knowledge, the deceptiveness of the senses? He talks about the evil demon that is altering his perception. And then he finds the possibility of escaping misrepresentation and deception using his consciousness. And here is my favorite example, my favorite movie of all time, The Matrix. Sometimes I think that I wrote this paper and did this research because I wanted to have the opportunity to write about this film. The Matrix is an updated and popular version of this Descartes and Plato. You're probably familiar with the story. It's the future has been taken over by the machine that have imprisoned sentient machines that have imprisoned human beings into pods where they live in a comatose state. They're used as batteries to heat the machine, but their mind is hooked to a complex computer simulation. So they think they're living the real life, but that is a simulation. And the story of the film is about this group of people who escape the pod and then start to fight against the machine. So if you like this kind of images, they apply to forms of description and resistance against the strategies of denialism and new denialism. There is a baseline reality. Climate change exists, despite what the oil industry used to say, or climate change exists and it's not going to be fixed just if we ride our bike. So we need to escape the cave, the pods in which the oil industry is trying to constrain us and see reality for what it is. But what the oil industry is doing now, it's something more difficult to challenge because it is establishing an entirely new reality. The point is not just saying there's no such thing as climate change or we can do a few things to solve them. They're actually taking control of the narrative of climate change. So if you look The Matrix and you jump to the third film, it emerges at the end of the film that the people who revolted against the machines, their revolution, their fight is actually part of the machine own design. The machine allows human beings to fight in order to stabilize their hegemony, their power. So there's no world beyond the machine. And this is what Bernard Looney of BP is telling us. He has said, if BP does not transition, the world won't transition. When companies and sectors like BP start to transition, the world will transition. What does that mean? It means that there is no world beyond oil companies. There is no world beyond oil. There's no way to escape the space of the machines. Let's see how this has practically worked, because of course there are spaces of resistance. So let's look at the most important conference on climate change, which is COP, and how things have changed over a brief span of a few years. In 2021, oil companies were banned from sponsoring and actively participating in COP26 in Glasgow because the organizers say, you know, if they do, they basically would steer the narrative against away from their culpability. In 2022, there was already a change. There were over 600 fossil fuel lobbyists, so 25% more than the year before. And 18 out of the 20 sponsors of the conference were tied to oil and gas companies. 2023 is really the moment. It's the COP of last year, chaired by Al Jaber. And the number of fossil fuel industry lobbyists skyrocketed to a staggering 2,000, almost 2,500, which is almost 400% more. And it's actually quite indicative that the CEO of ExxonMobil attended COP for the first time, and he said, I feel really welcomed. What about the COP that just concluded COP29? Well, many things could be said, but just focusing on the key issues that concern us. The president of COP was Mukhtar Balayev, was the former chief executive of Azerbaijan state-owned oil and gas company, SOCAR. There were more than 1,700 fossil fuel lobbyists. The CEO of COP29 was filmed supporting fossil fuel deals, remarking that SOCAR will continue to produce a certain amount of oil and gas, perhaps forever. So again, there's no world beyond oil. But the best part is the remarks of the president of Azerbaijan, which gave the opening speech, and that was then doubled down by OPEC Secretary General. Oil is a gift from God. Oil is a gift from God. So we find ourselves in a complete reversal of what is climate change, what is oil, and how what should be a major space of resistance, COP, a place that was not allowed to oil companies, in the space of a few years has been completely incorporated and dominated by oil companies. So while we're saying this is the status of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It has increased by 0.8% compared to last year. And this on your right, you see the cumulative amount of carbon dioxide since the Industrial Revolution. Now, as you can see, the growth is exponential. And if you see the projection based on the investment on oil companies and national plans over the next 5 years, that's going to be even more steep. So, to conclude, as the oil industry evolved from the deceptions of misrepresentation to simulation, I argue that any viable resistance must reclaim the meaning of climate change itself. We are at risk of losing sense of the real reality of climate change. So the fight against climate change is not solely for policy reform, but for its very reality. It needs to be freed from the economizing ontology of the oil industry and then rerouted in a renewed commitment to sustainability, environmental justice, climate action, and protection of the planet for future generations. All right, thank you very much.
Wow, thank you very much, Luca, for very fascinating presentation. And I don't know, I'm starting to doubt myself. Some people joke that we live in a simulation. Some people say it's a conspiracy, but it might be that, there's some truth to that. And so I think you've given us enough food for thought to really digest, but also maybe start responding to the very stellar presentation. And we'll do that through this Q&A session. So I'm sure there are quite a couple of you who have questions, whether it's here or online. So if you have a question, please tell us who you are and your affiliation, and then ask your question. And it'll be great to remember to add a punctuation mark at the end of your intervention, and that is a question mark. So floor is open. Yes.
Very, very enjoyable and interesting and nicely presented. Thinking of the kind of transition of the oil company thinking. Their idea of putting themselves as the savior of the planet is completely hypocritical, isn't it? Because at the same time, they're saying we want to carry on business as usual. And Bernard Looney, was he the one who got recently replaced at BP, or was he the new?
He's the new one. He was appointed in 2021. I mean,
the previous one was getting a bit green, and they called.
I mean, some of the quotes I gave are from one of the first interviews he gave after he was appointed, outlining his vision for the future.
That perception of the public is not associated with business decisions to change their priority. In fact, Shell and BP have actually moved away from some of their green promises and their green business investments to concentrate more on their core business. So, I mean, it does shock you to some extent, the degree of disconnect between what they will say in public and what they actually do when they're back in the boardroom.
The interesting element here is that in one of the interviews, he also said, where he says the things that I've mentioned, Looney says, and we are also expanding new oil fields, and we invest, I can't remember the amount that he says, and we won't apologize for that, because oil continues to remain core to our business, and oil is progress. So there is this idea that, yes, in the long run, you know, we'll go over that, but there is this idea of suspension of time, where this time will come is not clear. So there is no longer even the attempt to conceal. There is an outright, you know, way of saying this is what we are doing, and this we are leading the way in that kind of direction. And I think this is very much reflected in the institutional changes that we are seeing and the general support as well.
Yeah. Sorry, I should have said I'm Mike Walton from the European Academies of Science. And really their business model is now to shift the demand to CCS, which they can see as a new, fitting their criteria, a new business opportunity for them.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Rose Kubov. I'm a PhD student at Synergy, researching energy policy. And I was wondering if the whole narrative of taking responsibility is also maybe a personal coping strategy in a way to kind of explain it to themselves, or is it just a kind of way that they are representing it to the public? Have you looked into that?
You mean if there is a personal dimension by the various CEO? I don't know if there is a personal dimension, and I don't think so. I mean, but it's not really relevant what they think personally. I would be inclined to think that they believe what they think, but the interesting element for me is the extent to which the question of climate change is read entirely from a totalizing neoliberal logic. So it's recognition of the problem that finds solution entirely within a neoliberal framework. So, you know, they may generally believe in what they're saying. That does not detract from how dangerous what they're saying and they're doing is.
Great. So I think quite a couple of questions here, but we'll jump online and then come back here. Start living in a simulation source. So Laura, read writing online.
So from Jackson Online, it says a very interesting presentation. In your opinion, do you think that the oil industry is really responsible for driving the shift in narrative? Or do you think that it has arisen from general neoliberalization that has been occurring in the past few decades, i.e. facing economic considerations as a locus for concern?
I mean, neoliberalism is a structural force, but it's a structural force that is mobilized by corporate power. And therefore, the oil industry are major corporate powers that exercise that kind of deploy and mobilize that kind of discourse. I mean, having said that, there is a whole part that I don't explore in this paper, but I explore in another paper of the project, where I say that the real danger here is that this kind of narrative resonates with what we want to hear as consumers, because somehow it suits us. You know, if I'm told that by driving a bike, you know, I solve the problem, and if I'm told that someone is in charge fixing the thing, that I don't need to change my practices of consumption and my life as usual, that is quite reassuring. So, you know, I like to quote Mark Fisher in this regard. He says, you know, neoliberalism is a structural force, which nonetheless would be nothing without our cooperation, and it means our cooperation as individual beings. So we are not just at the mercy of that kind of force, but there's also a question of power differentials, and you know, corporate oil power has had a specific role. Its role as translated in delaying climate legislation, climate abstraction, delaying the capacity to develop awareness on the problem of climate change and the impact that burning fossil fuels have. And so there's plenty of work that has been done on that. And they not adopted the kind of denialist strategy, possibly, you know, we could have reached the state of awareness at which we are now, and that we are losing again, maybe 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So there are clear responsibilities of the choices that have been made by the oil industry as an agent of neoliberalization.
I think you.
Yes. Hi, I'm Yanni, PhD politics and officer at the Great Mountain Authority. Thanks very much. I think like kind of just seeing that kind of discourse and how it's evolved is actually really useful. Just like a couple of questions, I guess. So reading kind of about John Boswell's kind of magical thinking and public policy, and this idea that, you know, we have these big ideals and we're kind of really, really far off from them. We kind of do make ourselves believe them. And I wonder to what extent that's kind of applicable here when we kind of have this big ideal of, you know, we're going to have a sustainable future, very positive, this kind of completely eco-modernist vision, and the reality is so far off. So yeah, that kind of like more psychological understanding from people in power and what solution looks like. And then I also wanted to know if you're interested in looking at the kind of counter movements, and I think there was one image of the kind of social movement side of it, but in terms of what that looks like now, it's obviously a big kind of situation at COP, and you know, people protesting, people are not happy, and indigenous groups are not happy, and to what extent the kind of solution lies in listening to those voices as well.
Okay. I mean, yes, I mean, this question of the magical solution that comes in, it's part of the techno-capitalist late modernity in which we exist and live. So, I mean, the thing I was reading yesterday is this new idea of spraying, I think it's sulfur dioxide, if I'm not wrong, in the atmosphere in order to create a sort of mirror in order to reduce heating. So in order to compensate the global warming caused by carbon dioxide with this solution. And this is something very much encouraged by the US administration, the new administration, that will, the Trump administration. When I read about these things, they remind me of this movie, Don't Look Up. You know, there is this comet hitting the Earth, and then we can exploit that economically. There are a number of startups that now are born around this project of spraying this stuff in the atmosphere, which we don't know what it's going to cause in terms of you know, impact on the environment, or how it will impact you know, the weather in different parts of the world. What is interesting for me is that all these solutions, they boil down to a common denominator, which is profit, which is making money. You have a startup that feeds into this kind of new market that has been created. It is the idea that somehow we can fix the problem, make money, and continue to live as we do. And the two dimensions are unsustainable. They cannot come together. There must be a point in which we come to terms with the fact that certain practices, certain levels of consumptions are no longer sustainable. And that is very much delayed by this, you know, magical thinking you were kind of referring to, the solution that will fix the problem. Sorry, what was your second? There was a second part to the question.
About the kind of indigenous resistance going on with COP.
Yeah, I'm not very good with resistance. I think I'm very good at outlining catastrophic and depressing scenario. Every time I give a talk on other subjects, then what can we do? The first thing we can do is, in my view, in this case, is to try to disassociate the two dimensions. There is a reality of climate change that needs to be understood not in economic neoliberal terms. So recovering that kind of reality is the first step. And I don't think it's an abstract or philosophical question, because the problem is the appropriation of the narrative. I mean, what neoliberalism does, what neoliberal corporate power does, it does not erase, it rewrites within a different language and a different grammar. So what we can do is really reappropriate that kind of dimension and recognize the extent to which these kind of are embedded in the individual and structural processes of which we are part.
Great. So I see we have a couple of hands. So what we'll do is now, I put you on the spot, Luca, and I put everyone on the spot. So we ask this one question, and then we take the first round of 3, and then we try to answer in 4 minutes. The next round of 3, the last round of 3, and then you answer in 3 minutes. The first round of 3, yes.
Is that me?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Lovely. I teach environmental law here in the Department of Plan Economy. First, a compliment. That was an excellent summary of the matrix. I spent a lot of my youth trying to figure out that, but thank you for that. My question was really about the platform where this is happening, right? So you're talking about the COPs. And you talked about the companies, but some of these companies, as you pointed out, are state-owned companies as well. And I was just curious about all this kind of grandstanding that's happening at COPs and the impact on the text itself. Because the other thing which is happening is fossil fuels were anyway hardly mentioned, and now with COP29, there's a lot of silence around having fossil fuel in the text itself. So I was just wanting to hear from you about the relation between corporate power outside COP and the impact of that corporate power inside in terms of the text and the decision-making process. Because in your presentation, there was the shadow of the state, but it almost felt like the state was not the actor you were so concerned about. But the reason there is so much corporate power being exercised is because of this invisible or very visible hand of the state. So I just wanted to ask you about the relationship between those two things. So much influence of fossil fuel outside and such silence on fossil fuel inside the COP rooms, really. Thanks.
Yes, could you check maybe
Yes.
2 more questions? Since Maurice, and it's one and one here, and then we go on.
Thank you. I'm slightly reminded of what happened in Australia in the last sort of 2 centuries, which is that the British kept coming along and introducing species, and then having a problem. And so the solution was to introduce more species to eat the species they introduced. And then you had to introduce species, and then introduce more species, and this kept happening. So they'd solve a problem with the same problem, and then have twice as much problem. The main problem being that don't bring new stuff to Australia, okay? Just leave it. Is there any sort of parallel you can draw here that, are we trying to solve the problem of, are this going to try to solve the problem of energy consumption by encouraging more energy consumption in a different way? Are you ending with now 2 problems? Is there any way to sort of bring this back to a problem of actual consumption and say, well, let's try and use less stuff rather than trying to keep the amount we consume constant and just make it a different way? Should we be using less energy or going around and not just introducing more energy mechanisms?
Great. I think we're testing your memory now.
I'm writing things down, otherwise, yeah.
I have one more question here. Yes. And then,
Sarah Cinnamon, ex-teacher, ex-consultant, now rower and member of the Joint Public. Yeah, of course, really fascinating. I'd like to ask you about the language climate change, because way back in the day, it was climate warming, and I think people got kind of fuzzy feeling and the feeling of, great, we're going to have some nice warm summers. Then we moved on, obviously, from that. Where would you put, should we use the words climate crisis instead of change? Does that kind of help with people's the perception that it is a crisis rather than it's just changing to something warmer?
How much time do I have?
you have 2 minutes to answer.
Right, okay. I don't think I can answer all the questions. So, we'll be very brief, happy to talk to you later. So taking them in order, why relation between corporate power and states? There are 2 questions there, relation between states and market. we increasingly struggle to see the distinction between the two. Somehow states provide a framework in which corporate actors can operate. And why oil is not mentioned? Because oil has been normalized. It doesn't need to be mentioned because somehow the idea that it's there, but then it will be overcome at some point, but we don't know when. It's the kind of new normal, and that's really a dangerous thing. The second question about the new species to Australia. So we try to solve a problem, and then we create a new problem. Well, that's what capitalism does. The moment you have a problem, you need to find a solution, and the solution is a market. And therefore, you want to multiply the problems because you create new markets. And if you create new markets, you create new profits. It's the idea that when capitalism sees a barrier, it tries to circumvent and incorporate the barrier and make profit out of the barrier. The term crisis, would it help? I don't think so, because somehow we have become so accustomed by crisis. The 2008 financial crisis, the refugee crisis, the cost of living crisis. I think, I don't remember which dictionary coined the word of the year a few years ago, 2 years ago, was the word perma-crisis. We live in a permanent state of crisis, and that, again, shifting the name has been, again, normalized. Climate change, climate crisis, and what you said about the warm weather, and people say, oh, we're gonna have a nice summer. I've seen it recently, I live in Canterbury, which has a special microclimate, I can say it's really warmer, but sunny day in February, I remember this year, 18, 19 degrees, and people were saying it's really nice. And no one was saying this is not supposed to be the way it should be. Okay, it's nice for a moment, but this is not right. So yes, I mean, I don't think crisis would do the trick, because now we have been accustomed to that kind of term.
Great, so I've realized ignore this side of the room. So we've got 3 questions here, and then we'll have the last round on that. Yes.
So, my question is about, I guess, this constructed reality which emerged at the conferences. But do you have any evidence that people genuinely live outside this sphere, in this narrative, in this simulated reality? Because I think this is very important, because if people actually start believing this, yes, this is a very dangerous thing. If not, if you don't see evidence of that, then I guess we can just say that CAP is a tool which is not fit for purpose. These are 2 very different kind of things that we have to address. So I think it's very important to understand what's going on with general public and understand it.
Great, so I think we'll have 2, and then you have, I think, the last round.
Hi, I'm Cecilia, environmental policy analyst. My question is whether you have a sense of the most effective mechanisms and platforms by which there has been this reconstruction of reality, and then on the other side of that, kind of mechanisms and platforms that you've either seen people try or you think people should try for the point of reclaiming that meaning.
Great.
Hi, I'm Arjun. I'm with the Department of Land Economy. I'm just curious whether you've seen any instances of these kind of constructed simulations from other sectors in the past, maybe like tobacco or gambling or something like that, and what happened?
Oh yeah, okay. How much time?
2 minutes. You're doing very well.
Right. Yes, I mean, the paper as it stands focuses primarily on, those who create the master narrative, but is it something that, I think this is a narrative that intersects the will of the public. And what I do in the paper, I extensively discuss the world of scholar of environmental politics called Bludorn, which is one of the first who have worked with the Baudrillardian framework. And he basically talks about an alliance between consumers and corporate power, about this kind of process of collective self-deception. So I build on that part in order kind of to support the view how this kind of narrative resonates with an unwillingness really to undertake change. But more anecdotally, all the commentaries I've read about COP29 were highlighting the indifference that somehow characterized the conference in terms of the general public, far from the activist voices that there seem to be. It could be a thing of the COP itself, and therefore other venues have to be taken. But how long before all those other spaces and places of resistance then are taken over by the oil industry themselves? So that is the question. I'm not arguing that we already live in the world of the machines like the Matrix. There are still spaces of resistance, but that is the kind of trajectory that I'm kind of outlining. Sorry, what the second question? Yes, sorry, I didn't quite catch you said the question was about the mechanism through which they have.
Essentially, how are they doing this? Where and how are you seeing any of the reclaiming?
How the oil industry is doing this? Well, direct communication interviews. I mean, the quotes I provide are from interviews they've given to Time magazine, the speeches they give to the public, the commercials that the company produced. If you go on their web page, they have a whole series of programs like, where claim you can offset your emission, Shell, for instance, that. So there are multiple channels. Think tanks as well, which no longer work to deny, but to support that kind of narrative. There's all sorts of new think tanks that somehow promote this kind of techno-capitalist solution that will solve the problem and somehow present them as the magical solution that will fix everything. Final question, have we seen that before? Yes, I think we have seen. I think the tobacco industry is a good example. I mean, if we use the parallel, the shift from smoking cigarette to vaping, it's absolute genius in that regard. And Philip Morris has a massive stake in that regard. You produce a product that you claim does not affect your health, and you can consume as much as you want because it's not as disgusting as the cigarette. So I think we should keep looking at what the tobacco industry is doing for how bad things can go. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Before we are at the top of the hour, so this is the last one, kind of a brief question, and one from the audience, and then we're going to try it all together in a minute.
Sorry. Yeah.
So there are two questions.
Yes. Yeah.
Slightly, Jeff, about major slight supplementary question. So, although the tobacco industry, although vaping kind of they've come back with this, there was a time, at least it's worked in the UK, the US, where smoking has decreased dramatically. So, is there some hope, or are there lessons to be learned for consumers in this part of the equation and in the illiquid structure to do something? So how do we reclaim the meaning of climate change? Is that the key to the next step to fighting against it?
Great. Last question online, and then try to together.
So from Martha, Phil Politics and International Studies, what is your opinion on climate debt from responsible countries in the global north to those in the global south, not just loss and damage funding, but the idea of reparation?
Okay, so 1 minute, 2 questions. I'm not hopeful because what vape has done is it's not been adopted by people who used to smoke. People have not generally moved from cigarettes to vaping, but it's actually targeted a new market of young people. So what we see is the opening of a new market. I mean, there's a very interesting documentary that tells this story, which is actually quite accurate, which is called The Story of Juul, which was the first e-cigarette that marketed itself as, and they basically, their mission was, we are going to help people free themselves from the slavery of tobacco. And then they realized that people who used to smoke didn't move to that. And then what it really worked with young people as this kind of trendy product. And so they opened an entire new market. And if we look at the numbers, the majority of consumers are young people who did not used to be smokers before. So the percentage of those who are actually shift from one to the other is minimal. So does that make me hopeful for that? Of course not, but I'm never hopeful. But that's my default position. And on the question of what we can do, that will be for my next presentation and the next paper. I need to work on hope, but I actually have written a paper on hope. I keep forgetting about that paper because it came out. I think one way of how much time do I have?
20 seconds.
Well, I mean, we can talk about that later because it would be a bit too long. Just to answer the final question in 15 seconds. Yes, I mean, I agree with the reparation. I think there must be a mechanism in place. What worries me of that is also that the whole discussion has been heavily focused on that. And again, we are talking about the discussion that is a market mechanism. We cannot think of solution that transcends the market. So here we are thinking about transaction, giving money to compensate for something, which is the kind of the same logic of the carbon offsets. You know, this is, we can compensate either at an individual level or at a structural level with carbon emissions. You buy credits, and they have proved to be a failure. So if you download the app of Shell, then you can decide to pay your fuel a little bit more, and Shell tells you that by paying that few cents, few pennies more, you offset your emission. That is not true in the first instance, and conveys the idea that we can keep going as we're doing, just paying for things a little bit more. And things is much more complex than that, and really affects our practices of consumption. So until we come to terms with that, we are easy prey of this kind of corporate narrative, because in a sense, they tell us what we want to hear, that no change is needed for change.
Thanks, Luca, for that very kind of powerful closing where no change is needed for change, which kind of gives us a lot of food for thought. But a huge thank you to you for a very stellar presentation. And what I take from this presentation, I think is extending it more broadly to how we also think of, other kinds of catastrophic and essential risks, drawing lessons from here. First, the question of framing, how do we understand the problem? Because usually we assume we have the same kind of a similar understanding, but it seems there's also a simulated kind of understanding of the problem. One can see this in very different ways. There's a problem of the contradictions and paradoxes. For example, the people who are responsible for driving or creating certain risk, claiming to be the ones who also want to go with that risk. And maybe finally thinking about collective responsibility, who should be in, who should be out. So these are kind of foods for thought, but I think they bring us to the very end of a very fruitful seminar. So a huge thank you to Luca for the presentation.